Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. It's a wonderful evening, and we're here for the launch on behalf of Bookings and Publishing of Senator Leyonhjelm's book, Freedom Salesman. And to get us underway, we've got not just one launcher, but two launchers. And the first person is Tony Shepherd, AO, former chairman of the National Audit Commission, former chairman of the Business Council of Australia, and the current chairman of the Greater Western Sydney Giants. Give them a cheer, the Giants! Hey. And welcome, Tony Shepherd.
Thank you very much, Max, and it's great to finally meet Shari's dad. David Leyonhjelm is like a compass for those of us who genuinely believe in economic and social freedom. You may not agree with everything he says or believes, but the underlying philosophy is always heading in the right direction. He's been a very welcome addition to the crossbench in the Senate, and he's a breath of fresh air in the cloistered political environment with its constant attacks on freedom and its tax and spend phobia. Of course, he's in the fortunate position of being a crossbencher, and then doesn't have the problems of putting in place these policies, but he uses his luxury in this position better than just about any crossbencher I've ever seen. He's a true libertarian who is constantly focused on reducing the role of government in a country with 3 levels of government, to my mind, are often in a competition to see how many regulations they can pass. He's a wonderful foil for the left, who are besotted with regulation and want the government to control our economic life and liberate our social life. And he's an antidote to the right, which believes in the opposite, which is they want the government to control our social life and free our economic life. His beliefs are founded in philosophy of John Stuart Mill and John Locke, that government's roles should be restricted to protecting life, liberty, and private property. I read through his book and I realised that we have sort of a common history in terms of where we landed up. I started life as a federal public servant, believed in big government, a little bit socialist. David started out in Young Labor, was a fervent member of the anti-conscription campaign during the Vietnam War, and then in his typical contrarian way, he became a reserve in the army. One major point of difference is that David has some Swedish royal blood in his background. It's also hard to believe that his family originally came from Sweden, which is of course the poster child of social democracy. Speaking of conversions, I met my fellow speaker Mark Latham, over here to my right, as a young MP from Western Sydney. He was definitely left at that stage, but extremely bright and irreverent. He was also very entertaining. He's the same character today, but he has clearly moved from the left. Mark further demonstrates his intelligence, but not only by supporting David, but also by supporting the GWS Giants. And he's a great guy. So and making a wonderful difference. My first real contact with David was after he entered the Senate in July 2014, but unfortunately that was after we'd released the National Commission of Audit, and I'd been torn apart in a Senate inquiry, which I actually quite secretly enjoyed. But David was one of the few Senate crossbenchers with a strong and logical commitment to expenditure reduction. And you should buy this great book of his because there's 2 great chapters in the book. One is headed Balancing the Budget, and the other is called Spending Addicts. And these 2 chapters I thoroughly recommend. After meeting him, I started reading all his other stuff, and his views on just about everything I found stimulating, and I agreed with virtually every one of them. Renewable energy, free trade, minimum wage, penalty rates, genetically modified crops, childcare, all of his views were eminently sensible. But at the core was my attraction to his basic philosophy and the way he has identified Australia's slide from a free country to which loves more and more regulation, believes in tax and spend, the nanny state, political correctness, and helicopter parenting. We've turned a nation of rugged individualists and innovators with an irreverent sense of humour into some of the biggest whingers in the world. A country where people expect the government or the taxpayer to cover them for every conceivable risk or misadventure in their life. Of course, it's this decline which is the cause of most of our current political and economic challenges, whether it be energy cost or availability, poor productivity, low wage growth, job security, the cost of childcare, housing affordability and availability, education and training. You need to go no further than government. We've got 3 levels of government in Australia in competition, as I said before, to see how many laws and regulations they can pass. In fact, they see their main KPI is how many regulations have they passed. The law degree seems now to be a prerequisite for a seat in the Australian Parliament. We learnt from the great reforms of the 80s, 90s and noughties that the less government is directly involved in our lives and the freer the markets, the better we are off. These reforms have produced 26 years of continuous growth and are responsible for our current high level of prosperity. But unbelievably, these very reforms that have delivered so much are under attack from both the left and the right. Thank heavens for leaders like David who are calling this. I'll give one example, and one that's close to David's heart. Free trade is vital to a small country of 24 million people. We have only 2 industries left which are globally competitive: the demonised resource sector and agriculture. We were also very good at one stage, not too long ago, at minerals processing, but governments made sure they killed that off through their crazy, short-sighted energy policies. We survived the GFC and prospered, not because of pink bats and building school halls and swanky schools. We survived and in fact prospered from massive and unprecedented investment in the commodity boom. Now, coal, iron ore and gas are the devil incarnate, despite the obvious fact that through taxes, royalties, jobs and huge investment in infrastructure, they are keeping us afloat. Governments, at the behest of the community and often supported by a compliant media, are sucking the very lifeblood out of our country. And David Leyonhjelm is calling it. I commend Freedom Salesman to all of you. It should be on the curriculum for a high school and first year economics, philosophy and political science at university. It'd probably be a waste in the law faculty. But at least, if we could get our children educated in this form, we may have some chance of stopping the rot and protecting the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony Shepherd. Ladies and gentlemen, your second launcher of this book, it's my privilege to introduce a dozen or so years ago, who was the federal leader of the Australian Labour Party. He then, I think sometimes people thought, like Churchill had his wilderness years, he went away, then came back, and Mark Latham is back. He's everywhere you go. You can see him on Sky, you can see he's on Alan Jones' show later on tonight, you catch him on the radio with Jonesy every week and Ben Fordham. Online, his Mark Latham's Outsiders.com, .com.au or .com, you can find him there. And even, I think tomorrow night, you've got Milo Yiannopoulos. There's the Mark and Milo show tomorrow night. His book Outsiders has just been released, was launched by Alan Jones last week. Please would you put your hands together and welcome the recent recruit to the Liberal Democrats. Please welcome Mark Latham.
Well, thank you very much, Max. To Tony and David, ladies and gentlemen, it's often said that we live in a fast-changing world of uncertainty. And that was my reaction to this book, because when I was in the Parliament, it was always said that senators didn't even read books, let alone write them. You know, what the hell is going on when a senator writes a book? And what a book it is. It's a remarkable program of libertarian thinking, comprehensive across all the areas of government. And as I went through the 350 pages, it struck me that, David, you're responsible for a remarkable achievement, because so many MPs these days, it's about stunts. You know, your senatorial colleagues are there herding sheep in California, or they're eating halal burgers to try and get a run in the media. You've actually been doing hard, solid policy work, because this is the ancient art of persuasion, that you're not just putting forward libertarian ideas, you're backing them with research, citing examples to support your case. It's old-fashioned politics that we see so little of today. And going through the book, I thought it was a very sad commentary on the modern press gallery, which is hollowed out of expertise, that it does take sheep herding in California or halal burger eating to get coverage out of the gallery, and a lot of this stuff has been missed. So I'm very glad to be speaking here today at the launch, just to point out the quality of the book. It's a tribute to you, David, and your staff. You must have remarkable staff who do a hell of a lot of research. You must be cracking the whip on them to be in the library, going through all the sources and research. The extent of your program reminded me very much, not so much in content, but in its comprehensiveness, of what Gough Whitlam did for the Labor Party in the 1960s. And it was often said of Whitlam in that period around the Parliament House that while other MPs were drinking, he was thinking. While other MPs were dining, he was refining his ideas. And Whitlam was all about social democratic expansion. You've even got a stanza about him in the book. You're about rebalancing the role of government to restore principles of freedom, both in society and the economy. And it's a very timely reminder of the economic benefits that Tony spoke about. It's remarkable Australia, at the fag end of this 26 years of unbroken economic growth, has basically forgotten. There's a national amnesia about the things that created the growth in the first place coming out of the 80s and 90s. Deregulation, getting government out of the way, the financial sector opened up, protectionism ended, systems deregulated, markets deregulated across the board. It was freedom in the economy that got politicians out of the way and allowed entrepreneurs to grow Australian GDP. And we have reminders around the world now. I'm reading things in the paper, I've got to look 3 or 4 times at them to see whether or not it's true, that socialism, economic socialism, is making a comeback. We know cultural Marxism has been around, but people are now writing of economic socialism. I don't see so much of it in terms of electoral reality. In France, the socialists were smashed by Macron, who's now deregulating their industrial relations system. In Germany, the Social Democrats were smashed. In the United States, Hillary's still asking what happened. In New Zealand, Labor was at 20% of the vote until Jacinda Ardern got a honeymoon for just being new. In Australia, Bill Shorten has negative popularity rates of 20 or 30. They're minus figures. In Canada, Trudeau is riding high, but it's more on identity politics than economics. And all they've got really is Jeremy Corbyn. The socialists are left with old Jeremy there pottering away in the United Kingdom with renationalisation of assets as his policy, higher taxes, tax and spend. And he was in the low 20s before the British election, and it was only when they worked out that Theresa May wasn't much of a campaigner. She campaigned like a wet sand shoe, and Corbyn had his renaissance. So I don't think socialism on the economic front is doing all that well around the Anglosphere. You look at it, it's a pretty dismal picture in France, Germany, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and through to the UK. But just for a single moment, if anyone did think socialist economics could make a comeback, they need to read this book. They need to read this book to understand the stupidity of their ways. And David, in going through it, it wasn't just a reminder of some of the research skills and dedication of a Gough Whitlam. It was also a reminder of that wonderful, somewhat forgotten liberal giant of the late 60s and 70s, Bert Kelly, who was dry before it was fashionable. He was arguing all the clever cases against protectionism and industry subsidies, and he was known as the modest member, and he had a career influencing policy, not so much as a legislator, but influencing policy. And you could say he was one of the founding fathers of the period of economic deregulation and opening up the Australian economy in the 80s. He provided a lot of the spade work earlier on. And David's got a wonderful stanza here at page 116 about the argument, you know, we've got this dreadful, incredibly expensive, ineffective federal contract that's gone to Adelaide for building submarines, and it's all on the basis of winning votes. Apparently the merit of spending $50 billion was to put Christopher Pyne back in the Parliament. Surely the most ineffective spending program in the nation's history. But David stood up in the Senate and said, well, you know, Xenophon wants it in South Australia, Lambie wants it in Tasmania. David represents New South Wales, and he put in a bid as follows: that the submarine should be built in Western Sydney at Eastern Creek. Having lived in Western Sydney for over 50 years, I thought, this sounds all right, I wonder what he's got in mind. And he wrote as follows: the proprietor of a Penrith muffler shop by the name of Ferret advises me he could custom make plenty of submarine-shaped vessels at Eastern Creek for much less than $1 billion. And there's the proprietor of a Blacktown engineering conditioning shop, Raylene. She tells me she can source any number of Australian-made V8 engines to power the submarines. There's only one vexing question, however, and that is, should the engines be Ford or Holden? Which has been the perennial Western Sydney question as long as I can remember. And since I do not wish to marginalise half my voter base, I propose that this sensitive question be decided by plebiscite. In addition, New South Wales can provide everything else we need for submarines. And he goes on to say that you need the woolen products in there, I assume, for noise insulation. We want very quiet submarines made out of Western Sydney. And the wool would be sourced from Goulburn merino wool, knitted by Slim Dusty's daughter, and hung up in the submarine control room. This is such a wonderful proposal. And of course, an Aussie sub would not be complete without some bumper stickers commemorating various B&S balls and reminding foreign invaders to F off, we're full. To make it completely Aussie, I propose that the whole Eastern Creek Submarine Corporation be overseen by Dick Smith. And then David wraps up this argument that the most important reason to adopt my modest proposal is Western Sydney is home to about 1 million voters, and isn't that what this is all about? Well, how true, how true. So, you know, that is Burt Kelly-esque. The use of humour, ridicule, poking holes in a good-natured way in the argument about these submarines and their construction. I mean, that is just such an effective demolition of the argument using good humour. So it's not just the research and the quality of the argument. David, you mightn't think so, but he's got a wonderful sense of humour. And again, it's something that the press gallery has missed. So I was enchanted by this book. I wrote up a piece in the Daily Telegraph last week. I'm a bit restricted here today. I used all my best lines in the telly, but hopefully I've paid tribute and given you a decent outline of what it's about. The other thing about the book that I'd close on is its effectiveness in getting outside the echo chamber. So much of modern politics is people talking to people they agree with, who agrees with the next person. I'm describing ABC TV panels here where it's an agree-a-thon. They all sit there agreeing with each other. Well, David actually challenges people, sometimes from what might be thought of as a left-wing perspective, sometimes from a right-wing perspective, to get outside of their echo chamber and consider their thinking from first principles. And that is so desperately needed. I thought in coming here today, I would rely on an example of the echo chamber at work, because every day in the Australian media there's some new restriction on freedom of speech. And the unlucky outlet that caught my eye today, because I knew there was bound to be one, was the Australian newspaper cut and paste section, which has denounced Milo Yiannopoulos. And they've quoted Max Markson here, describing you, Max, as a spin doctor. Really? I can't believe that. And the Australian concludes, Milo really isn't our type of guy. And they think it's outrageous that he appeared on morning television yesterday. He shouldn't have a platform for his dangerous ideas and thinking. Now, you've got to understand, Milo Yiannopoulos was part of Breitbart, which played a significant role in the election of Donald Trump. Wouldn't you want to learn from someone who had that success in being a part, a small but significant part, of the most amazing election result in our lifetime? And this is a newspaper that on the front page that day, the morning of the American election, had the following words: "It's all over, Hillary has won. You can take it to the bank." We'll talk about a global financial crisis. If you took the idea Hillary's already won and took that to the bank, you'd have a very low rate of return. So this is a newspaper that absolutely and thoroughly embarrassed and humiliated itself with its stupidity on the day of the American election. And they're saying, in their echo chamber of stupidity and ignorance, that they wouldn't want to listen, wouldn't want to entertain, wouldn't want to talk, wouldn't want to interview this guy Milo Yiannopoulos, whether you like him or hate him, whether you think he's wonderful or terrible. He was part of a very, very significant political event. Why wouldn't you want to talk to someone who had the wisdom, at least, to be on the winning side of an election where you absolutely stuffed up and knew nothing? So, I mean, this is the national broadsheet with this kind of ignorance and restriction on freedom of speech. So your book is so timely in every single respect. I congratulate you, your staff. Staff are often overlooked in this, but they've done a power of work. You've put together a magnificent volume, 350 pages, the best stuff I've read in a long, long while. Congratulations, and happy to be part of the launch.
Thank you, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, the first Libertarian elected to federal parliament in Australia. As the book's title states, he is the defender of liberty and personal freedoms, to speak at the launch of his debut novel. Please would you welcome the author of Freedom Salesman, Senator David Leyonhjelm.
Thank you, Tony and Mark. Very kind of you. And thank you for coming along and saying nice things about my book as well. I actually have a pretty brief history with book launches. In fact, you could describe me as a bit of a book launch novice. The very first launch I ever attended was just 2 years ago. It was Chris Berg's book, The Libertarian Alternative. And the reason I attended was because I was the one doing the launching. I attended the launch of Tanveer Ahmed's book, Fragile Nation. Tanveer is my neighbour. And I was at the launch of Bill Leake's book, Trigger Warning, the day before he died. Both good books, by the way. Last night I was at the launch of Helen Dale's book, Kingdom of the Wicked, a novel, a new novel. Again, I was the one doing the launching. Now here I am tonight with my own book being launched. And the thing is, I didn't even set out to write a book. My book is simply a continuation, an extension of the task I set myself when I was elected to the Senate. It started in September 2013, although I wasn't sworn in, until July 2014. And that task was to convince Australians of the value of individual rights and freedoms. The book is a compilation of my articles and speeches over the last 3 years. And when I say many of my articles and speeches were drafted by my staff. I edited them all, sometimes quite heavily, but only a minority were written by me from start to finish. My objective with the articles and speeches, and now the book, is to convince Australians that their lives would be more prosperous, more fulfilling and happier if they did more for themselves and the government did less. I want Australians to believe in themselves and their capacity to use their skills, their talents, their determination to care for themselves and their family, to get ahead, to live a rich and fulfilling life, and that the government should get out of the way and let them do it. I want Australians to stop running to the government when life fails to meet their expectations, when they realise they're not as rich, famous or sexy as they imagine they ought to be. Or as Michael Costa puts it so eloquently, I'm fat, ugly and stupid. What's the government going to do about it? Before I was elected to Parliament, journalists used to tell me I was confused because I didn't conform to the left-wing, right-wing paradigm. I was in favour of free trade, lower taxes, privatisation of government businesses. I'm a sporting shooter and I support fishing and four-wheel driving. Now these are all supposedly right-wing issues. But then I also supported legalisation of cannabis, assisted suicide, same-sex marriage and a host of other issues that have been claimed by the left. Getting elected gave me an opportunity to introduce those journalists and others to the concept of consistent principles, something I discovered is rather rare in politics. In particular, I've sought to demonstrate how it is possible to consistently apply the principle of freedom freedom from the government. It's that principle that drives me, the Liberal Democrats, and those who think like me. We describe ourselves as libertarians or classical liberals. And it's why I think a book like this is important, because the message needs to go out beyond journalists and political tragics. It needs to be heard by voters. The fact is, we all have a little bit of libertarian in us. Everyone thinks the government overreaches somewhere. It might be speed limits, alcohol taxes, having a smoke or riding a bicycle. When I established the nanny state inquiry a couple of years ago, it was amazing the number of people who got in touch to discuss their personal nanny state objection. The problem is, not enough people think the government overreaches almost everywhere. Even worse, while complaining about overreach in one area, too many people demand increased intrusion in another. Freedom for me, but not for thee, is very common. It's not just rare amongst politicians that consistency of principle is lacking. But having a little bit of libertarian is better than having none. It means there's hope. That's why I was able to muster an eclectic group of people to provide cover endorsements. If you haven't already seen them on the back of the page, I'll mention them now. Of the people who provided endorsements, only John Roscombe is, in my estimation, this is all personal opinion, is a true libertarian. And his main failing is his loyalty to the Liberal Party. Andrew Bolt and Corey Bernardi, who also provided endorsements, are economic libertarians. They agree the government should get out of our pockets, but they don't oppose the government having a say over our social lives. We tend to apply the word conservative to describe people like Andrew and Corey, although that's not a historically very accurate use of the term. Now, Mark Latham also provided endorsement here. As you know, he's a former leader of the Labor Party, and the Labor Party is far from libertarian on either economics or even social issues, although there are a few social issues where they're somewhat liberal. Mark has come a long way down the libertarian path. He wrote that wonderful piece in the Daily Telegraph last week about me and my book. But this is not a criticism of Mark. I'm going to mention the fact that he parted company with me and the party on 3 issues: anti-terrorism, policing and gun laws. These are important issues to libertarians, and I'm going to come back to them in a moment or two. Sam Dastyari provided a cover endorsement. Sam is actually more libertarian than his party, the Labor Party, and he's been of considerable assistance to me on the nanny state inquiry. But he's also a loyal party man, so whatever his private views might be, he subordinates them to Labor's position. The Greens find me difficult. They support freedom sometimes, which is why Scott Ludlam, who also provided a cover endorsement, Scott Ludlam and I worked together to try to protect some fundamental rights in the context of the counter-terrorism legislation. But then, way too often, they revert to complete control freaks. Some say the only reason libertarians ever have the same position as the Greens is because they're like a stopped clock, accurate twice a day. I don't necessarily share that view. Fundamentally, they are no different from most other political players. They support freedom sometimes, but not others. With the exception of Lee Rhiannon, who is a socialist, they have no consistent principles. And while I think Lee's principles are wrong, I acknowledge and applaud her consistent support for them. And then there's Malcolm Turnbull, who provided a cover endorsement as well. Like the other people who are on the cover, I like him and I have a friendly relationship with him. And I have a video of him claiming that he is a libertarian. Before he became Prime Minister, he used to tell me he was the second most libertarian person in Parliament. Well, he certainly has libertarian views on some social issues, and he doesn't believe in imposing his views on others via the law, and that's commendable. But on economics, I'm afraid he's not one of us. He really does think governments can intervene to improve markets, not just to prevent harm to others, such as from fraud, theft and so on, but to improve markets. And that brings me to John Stuart Mill's harm principle. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilised community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That obviously applies to many social issues, and I've quoted it on many occasions, but it also is relevant to economic factors. Intervening in markets is a form of coercion. Market failure is a consequence of government intervention, not a justification for intervention. And of course, taking our money from us in the form of taxation and using it to do something that we could do for ourselves is serious coercion. Indeed, freedom from coercion is probably as good a statement of the libertarian principle as any. And that brings me back to Mark's concerns about terrorism, policing and guns. If you believe in a government that respects the rights of individuals, legal due process, habeas corpus, equality before the law, freedom of speech, assembly and worship, then clearly it is important that the government be kept in check. As the saying goes, if the government fears the people, you have liberty. If the people fear the government, you have tyranny. How then is it possible to keep the government in check if the only people with guns are those in government uniforms? If the government gives itself the power to hold people without charge, including children, to present evidence to a court that's kept secret from the accused, and to prevent the media from reporting on any of this, even if it's in the past and even if there has been abuse by those same people in uniform, is that a free society? Why do we even fight the terrorists if in doing so we lose the freedoms that distinguish us from them? Some of you might have heard me previously discuss and compare the philosophies of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. I'm going to very briefly explain my views on that. Thomas Hobbes claimed life was nasty, British and short, with war the natural state of human existence. The only way to end war and achieve civilisation, in his view, was to relinquish all power to the government, which then allowed people certain rights. And if the government wanted to take those rights back, it could do so. John Locke was completely different. He argued that we are naturally industrious and peaceful, but to achieve civilisation, we need to relinquish certain freedoms to the government. But those rights, those freedoms, belong to us, and we only relinquish as much as is necessary to protect life, liberty and property. And whatever freedoms we relinquish can be retrieved from the government if it misuses them, by force if necessary, as Thomas Jefferson pointed out. Thomas Jefferson, first President of the United States, was a great libertarian. Needless to say, libertarians are Lockeans. We do not trust governments. We do not believe they are benign or that they inherently make our lives better. Once they go beyond protecting life, liberty and property, they are too big. When we take the path of Hobbes and relinquish our freedom to the state in the hope it will keep us safe, we end up neither free nor safe. That's the path we're now on, and opposing that is the cause I am fighting. My book is an attempt to convince people, more people, that freedom is not free. It must be treasured, protected, fought for, and that there is a price to be paid. And that we do not lose our freedom in one fell swoop, but incrementally, in little bits, always with the justification that it's necessary and won't be too bad. Maximilien Robespierre wrote, "The secret of freedom lies in educating people, whereas the secret of tyranny is in keeping them ignorant." I want to ensure that freedom, including protecting the freedom we have, is no secret. Now, in case it hasn't been sufficiently clear, my aim is to sell copies of the book. The royalties go to the Liberal Democratic Party. There are 116 separate pieces in it, covering quite a range of topics. But to convince you that the book is worth reading, I thought I might read out a couple of pieces. Well, I'll read one, because Mark, one I was going to read out was the bit about the submarines, building the submarines in Western Sydney. The draft of that was written by my former media advisor, Gavin Atkins, who is here tonight.
And he's here.
Yes, I know, I was just about to say that, he's here. But there is one that Mark didn't read out, which I thought you might find slightly amusing. and it's headed South Australia. South Australia needs an intervention. If we can think of Australia's Federation of States being like a family, there is one family member that needs more than a good talking to. It needs an intervention. South Australia needs intervention because its problems are self-inflicted, and because too many South Australian politicians have developed a monstrous sense of entitlement. If the South Australian government was a person, it would be an obese 40-year-old man with awful body odour who lives with his mother, refuses to work and plays Xbox all day. He pauses only to demand more cheesels and iced coffee or to complain when the lights go out. It really is that bad. Now, can I tell you, when I wrote that article, I gave that speech, I think it was a speech. What did Nick Xenophon do? He gave me a packet of cheesels. So you can see, I think the book has something for everyone, and I am on a mission. My mission is to convert everybody from being a little bit libertarian to being libertarian across the board. Thank you very much.
Don't go away with any. I want to do two things. Questions from the media or the public. We're taking some questions now, please. Will you answer them?
Sure.
Thank you, of course you will. It's your book launch, you've got to. So please, put your hand up, shout out, and we'll take questions. If you don't, we'll go straight to signing books.
Will you be choosing Mark Latham as one of your Senate candidates in an upcoming election, given that Helen Dale has refused the offer?
She asked the question last night. That's not my decision. It's actually a decision for the National Executive. Hasn't been discussed at this point. So the answer is I don't know, and I can't tell you. I could give you a personal opinion, but I won't. So,
what would be the best way, in your viewpoint, to commence to remediate the budget?
well, it's fairly early on in the book. I've got quite a comprehensive article in there. There's a difference between what needs to be done and what can be done politically. What needs to be done is a wholesale abandonment by, at the very least, the Commonwealth Government of a whole range of programs. Cutting back on programs is a difficult exercise, and whereas cutting programs entirely is a lot easier. For example, we have a health department, a Commonwealth Health Department, which employs thousands of public servants, doesn't employ any hospitals, any doctors who treat patients or nurses who treat patients or run any hospitals, and yet there are thousands of public servants in it, and all the state governments also have health departments with thousands of public servants. We have an education department which doesn't employ any teachers who teach kids or run any schools, and yet there are thousands of public servants in the department. And the state governments also obviously employ thousands of public servants in their schools. We have an environment department, a Commonwealth Environment Department, that fundamentally duplicates what the states do. So in my ideal world, if I was dictator for the day, or libertarian dictator for the day, which is kind of a contradiction, I would start with duplication, then I would start winding back on in other areas. The politics of that are obviously difficult. Amongst other things, I would stop funding the ABC and SBS. I would stop funding an awful lot of things. Politically, that's never going to be possible, and apart from encouraging people to be optimistic, I don't achieve anything by putting those ideas out there. But what I did do in the last budget was describe how balancing the budget, getting expenditure under control, is achievable if everybody takes a small haircut, and how cutting spending need not produce significant losers, but you could in fact wind back a little bit in a whole lot of areas and still bring the budget under control. And once you brought it under control, then you can start lowering taxes and lower spending further. And so there needs to be a little bit come off of all the expenditure areas that the government engages in. We have a national budget of $450 billion, I think it is, and our deficit is between $30 and $40 billion. So clearly, it's a less than a 10% haircut across if everybody wore some of the implications of cutting back and getting rid of the deficit just in 1 year. And of course, we don't even need to do that. You can do it over several years. So I think politically, that idea of everyone takes a haircut, everyone's in this together, it's Australia's problem, is a saleable proposition. But as I said, if I was running the show, I'd probably take an axe to more specific areas. So,
is it true that the Australian government borrowed $4 billion at 2.5% interest and then on-lent that to the IMF at 0.8%? If so, why?
Yeah, that's quite right. I suppose you could always argue.
Could you repeat that question? I didn't quite get back here.
So the question was, did the government borrow money at 2.4% and did it then lend it to the IMF at point something percent?
0.8.
Yeah, that is true. It did, more basically. I mean, there's always an argument about which dollars it gave the IMF. Did they come from free money, which is our taxes basically, or did it come from borrowed money? But I think it's a fair argument to say it came from borrowed money. It did it. I gave them an earful about it in the Senate. Of course, that didn't make much difference. And their argument is that the IMF should be funded. I don't believe them. I don't think it needs to be funded at all. And of course, there's even less reason to fund it when you've got to borrow the money to do so. We're borrowing money to pay pensions. We're borrowing money to prop up our health system. We're borrowing an awful lot of money to just to keep the wheels of Australia turning. Yes, sir.
Would you be in favour of removing the permit to acquire for firearms?
So firearms, would I be in favour of removing the permit to acquire? You wouldn't need a permit to acquire firearms if they didn't all have to be individually registered. Before 1996, that was the case except for pistols. Canada had individual registration of long arms until 3 or 4 years ago, and they've abandoned it. New Zealand never took it on. Most countries of the world don't have individual registration of long arms. They might have individual registration of pistols. So my view is there's no need, there's no justification, there's no evidence to support individual registration of long arms. So if I was running the show, that wouldn't be, and therefore you wouldn't need a permit to acquire. Let's chop up the back there.
Mike Baird was in the paper the other day saying that the environment in which politics is conducted has changed dramatically because of the rise of social media and the voice that gives to the small vocal minorities. How do you feel liberalism goes in the age of social media?
I read that article. I'm not sure that it profoundly changes politics. He was suggesting that it was profoundly changed, and I was trying to figure out what he was getting at. In the days before social media, everyone had an opinion. You know, can I be vulgar? No, I better not be vulgar. Everyone had an opinion, and yet they had no way of expressing it unless they wrote a letter to the paper or they went down the pub and shared it with their friends. These days, they can make that opinion known. But I'm not sure that the people are any different. It's just that they've now got a communications vehicle, a way of putting their opinion out there. And what has changed about the fact that those opinions are out there? It's reduced the capacity of the mainstream media to determine the social agenda, the agenda of civil society. It used to be that if the newspaper got outraged, it was assumed the people were outraged. Now the newspapers can get outraged, or TV for that matter, and it may or may not catch on because people have their own way of expressing their outrage. And there are times when people will be outraged and the media, the mainstream media, just don't pick up on it. And I quite like using Twitter to provoke outrage. It's good fun, and a little bit of outrage is quite a handy thing at times. But they get outraged about all kinds of things, and you hear some of the silly things that go on over somebody saying something, and then the poor silly fools who are on the end of that quite often feel compelled to apologise. I mean, I don't think the fact that that they're apologising makes them any different from before social media existed, and I don't think the fact that people's voices are being heard has changed the kind of people who are expressing those opinions. Sometimes they're informed, sometimes they're profoundly stupid, but mostly what's different is that there are more avenues to put an opinion out there, and my attitude to it is let it rip. I'm quite happy for people to say what they like on Facebook. If they're too abusive, we'll block them. On Twitter, I've got a warning on my handle saying ad hom abusers are blocked, and I block quite frequently.
Last question. Last question.
This gentleman just here.
Please.
You're obviously happy with the recent success in Western Australia. Do you actually think that the Liberal Democrats can pick up more state and federal seats?
Yeah. We actually have quite a well-developed plan to do exactly that. They recently changed the voting system in South Australia for the Legislative Council, so we have hopes that we might pick up a seat in the South Australian election next year. Is that next year or later this year? Victoria, we're reasonably confident that we can pick up a seat down there. They work on a group voting ticket system which favours small parties. We know how to operate group voting tickets. We do quite well at that. And we're pretty confident at least one seat is winnable down there. And then we're quite close to submitting our application for registration in New South Wales. You only need 2% of the vote to win a seat in New South Wales in the upper house. And we are very, very confident we can do that without spending a cent, as a matter of fact. So, it's a very good possibility we could end up with members of state parliaments in 3 more states by the end of middle of 2019. We're certainly working hard on that. We're we're building up good branch networks. We're raising funds. We're using modern social media, social engagement software as well, the same software that's used by the Republican Party in the US, as a matter of fact. And we're very pleased with the way the campaign is shaping up at this stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Leyonhjelm is going to move over there if you'd like to buy a book. We're obviously selling books. We're raising money for the party. Please would you put your hands together for Senator Leyonhjelm. And special thank you also to the City Tattersall's Club for their help in making tonight happen, in particular to their CEO Marcello. Thank you, Marcello, providing additional food platters. So there's food and drinks. Go and enjoy yourselves, but definitely go and join Senator Leyonhjelm and get yourself a signed book. Thank you again for being here tonight. Thank you. Good night.